on President Obama as well as my colleagues to engage in this vital effort now for the good of the American people. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Arizona is recognized.
I reluctantly request unanimous consent that the senator from Ohio be recognized following my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this body for 50 years has passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and for 50 years it has reached after conference has reached the President's desk and been signed by the President of the United States. There are many pressing issues that confront the United States Senate, the Congress, and the nation. But I don't think we should forget that our first obligation is to secure the safety of our citizens, and that can only be done by training, arming, equipping the men and women who are serving in the military. Now, Mr. President, we passed through the Senate Armed Services Committee a couple of months ago the National Defense Authorization Act, and it has some very important components in it to continue to support the men and women who are serving and their families and provide them with the equipment and training that they need to defend this nation. We are still in conflict in Afghanistan. We are on the brink of a crisis with Iran over nuclear weapons. We have adjusted our presence in Asia in response to the rising influence of China. The uprising in Syria threatens to spill over into neighboring countries, and of course the situation in Egypt is one that is clearly one of significant question as to how the Egyptian government and people will progress. Some would argue that in many respects the state of Israel is under more threat than at any time since perhaps the 1973 war. So we live in a dangerous world. We live in a very uncertain time. And it seems to me that our priority should be to bring the National Defense Authorization Bill to the floor. It received a unanimous vote in the committee by both Republican and Democrat. I'm proud of the relationship that the chairman and I have developed over many years of working together. I am confident, as we have in the past, that despite the fact that there will be hundreds of amendments that will be filed, that we can work through those and work through the process and bring the Defense Authorization Bill to a conclusion and then conference with the House and then signed by the President of the United States. We owe this to the men and women who are serving in the military. It is not our right, it's our obligation to get the authorization bill to the President's desk. And we may have significant disagreements, but for 50 years, this body has passed the Defense Authorization Bill, and it has been signed by the President of the United States, and we are in some danger. We're in some danger of not letting this happen this year. When you look at the remaining weeks that we have in session and the number of challenges that are before us, I think that it's time we step back and looked at the requirement to pass this legislation. I have some sympathy for the majority leader in that there is great difficulties in the way that we're doing business nowadays. But I hope my colleagues would all recognize on both sides of the aisle the importance of this legislation, and we must urge members on both sides to set aside our own personal agendas and do what's necessary for the defense of this nation. The bill provides $525 billion for the base budget of the Defense Department, $88 billion for operations in Afghanistan and around the world, and $17.8 billion to maintain our nuclear deterrent. It authorizes $135 billion for military personnel, including costs of pay, allowances, bonuses, and a 1.7% across-the-board pay increase for all members of the uniformed services, something I think all of us would agree is well earned. And that, by the way, is also the President's request. It improves the quality of life of the men and women in the active and reserve components of the all-volunteer force and helps to address the needs of the wounded service members and their families. As we and our NATO partners reduce operations in Afghanistan, the importance of transitioning responsibility to Afghan forces increases, as does the need to provide for the protection of our deployed troops. This legislation provides authorities. It provides our servicemen and women with resources, training, equipment, and authorities they need to succeed in combat and stability operations. It enhances the capability of U.S. forces to support the Afghan National Security Forces and Afghan local police as they assume responsibilities for security throughout Afghanistan by the year 2014. Weapons systems modernization is essential to the future viability of our national security strategy, and this legislation provides for substantial improvement of legacy ships, aircraft, and vehicles, while authorizing research and development investments to ensure that our troops remain the best equipped in the world. The bill authorized the President's request for missile defense and accelerates support for our allies, including the joint U.S.-Israeli cooperative missile defense programs like the Arrow weapon system and the David Sling short-range missile defense system. It provides multi-year procurement authority for the Chinook helicopters, V-22 aircraft, Virginia-class submarines, and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, reflecting estimated savings of more than $7 billion over 5 years. All of these things can't take place unless we pass the authorization bill. The committee also sought to improve the ability of the armed services to counter non-traditional threats, including terrorism, cyber warfare, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I believe that the key battlefield of the 21st century will be cyber warfare. And I'm concerned about our ability to fight and win in this new domain. To improve the Defense Department's cyber capabilities, this legislation consolidates defense networks to improve security and management, which will permit personnel to be reassigned to support offensive cyber missions, which are understaffed. The issue of nuclear proliferation is addressed. Counter the flow of improvised explosive devices and curtail the worldwide trade of narcotics are authorized in this bill. Especially important are provisions to enhance the capability of the security forces of allied and friendly nations to defeat al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and other violent extremist organizations. The Armed Services Committee extended the Defense Department's authority to train and equip forces in Yemen to counter al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and forces in East Africa to counter al-Qaeda affiliates and elements of al-Shabaab. To ensure proper stewardship of taxpayers' dollars and compliance with law and regulation, the bill promotes aggressive and thorough oversight of the Department's programs and activities. This includes adding funding for the Department of Defense Inspector General. The Department of Defense Inspector General reviews resulted in an estimated $2.6 billion in savings in 2011, a return on investment of more than $8 for every dollar spent. The committee mark also codifies the 2014 goal for the Department of Defense to achieve an auditable statement of budgetary resources. Further, it improves the cost effectiveness of DoD contracting by limiting the use of cost-type contracts for the production of major weapons systems. In addition, the bill includes a series of wartime contracting provisions drawn from the McCaskill-Webb bill, implementing the recommendations of the Commission on Wartime Contracting. And in that vein, the bill enhances protections for contractors that blow the whistle on waste, fraud, and abuse in defense contracts. Finally, this legislation requires the Secretary of Defense to submit a detailed report to Congress on the impact budget sequestration will have on military readiness and national security. Similar legislative language has been passed twice by this body and by the House of Representatives. The Congress does not yet have an accurate understanding of the implications of sequester beyond an assertion that the cuts would be devastating, which is the word used by the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, and nearly every other defense official we have queried. We must have this information as we begin the work of developing a balanced approach to deficit reduction that replaces sequestration with a responsible plan for getting our nation's finances in order. I want to repeat again, Mr. President, for 50 years, I am proud to say, and in the years that I've been in it, obviously, we have successfully authorized the programs and policies of the Department of Defense. I'm proud. I'm proud of what this committee has done. I'm proud of what the United States Senate has done. And I'm proud of what the Congress has done and the presidents that these pieces of legislation have come before for their signature. Let's not allow the anticipation of an election hinder our ability to act in the interests of the men and women who are so bravely serving our nation. So I hope the Majority Leader, in consultation with the Republican leader, will come to an agreement so that we can have a date certain, and I can assure the leadership on both sides that Senator Levin and I, again, will be able to expedite this process, allowing amendments and debate as they are called for, and at the same time come to a successful conclusion and make it the 51st year that we have succeeded in doing what's necessary to fulfill our most solemn and important obligation, and that is to do everything within our power to ensure the security of this nation. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Ohio.
President, asking us to send to dispense with a quorum call.
Without objection.
President, I rise today to address a problem facing too many communities in Ohio and North Carolina, all across our country, from small towns to big cities to suburbs to remote rural areas. Service members who have risked their lives protecting our nation shouldn't have to wonder whether or not they'll be able to find a job when they leave the service. Unfortunately, far too many do. On Monday, I was in Youngstown in northeast Ohio. I was speaking to Army veteran Pedro Colon. He's one of the first Mahoning County area veterans to be approved for VRAP. VRAP is a particularly important program for veterans in this country. It stands for Veterans Retraining Assistance Program. We just authorized it under the under the Vow to Hire Act. I'm the first Ohio senator ever to sit on the Veterans Committee for a full term. I take that responsibility seriously. One of the programs, one of the outreach efforts, one of the training programs, training efforts put together by Senator Murray and the Veterans Committee is this VRAP. Mr. Colon, Pedro Colon Jr., is a high school graduate in his early 50s, and even though he served in an Army medical laboratory as a specialist, civilian employers wouldn't accept his military training experience. In many cases, as the presiding officer knows, having such a huge military presence in her state, in many cases, employers are reluctant to hire veterans. Perhaps they're afraid of something that they might have learned in the military in terms of perhaps they haven't been tested for PTSD or whatever the reasons, but employers far too often seem reluctant to hire veterans in far too many cases. We know the unemployment levels are higher among veterans than they are the rest of the population. We know there's a particular problem for veterans who are a little bit older, who are, in the case of Mr. Colon, who are middle-aged. We also know that sometimes veterans, particularly if they came out of school, from out of high school and went directly in the service, that they might not know exactly when leaving the service how to apply for a job, how to do a resume, all those things that people learn when they're stateside in the civilian workforce, they learn to do. Well, but because of VRAP, Mr. Colon will now study at the Mahoning County Career and Technical Center beginning in September to train to become a medical assistant, something he knows something about from his military service, but was not certified and not too many employers, unfortunately, employable in that field. We have a responsibility to the Pedro Colons of the world to do something about the thousands of older veterans who are jobless or unemployed. VRAP is for veterans 35 to 60. The GI Bill, which most of us in this chamber supported earlier, helped veterans not as much as it should have, but in a significant way those veterans, those returning soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen and women who are a little bit younger than 35. But for many who are 35, like Mr. Colon, who is older than that, his opportunity has expired, if you will, to benefit from much of the GI Bill. So as we invest in our service members in times of war, we should do so when they return to their communities, when they hang up their uniforms, when they embark on the next phase of their lives. We have a role to play. This is a case where government can step in and help the private sector do the right thing to serve those veterans who served us. That's why the Veterans Retraining Assistance Program, which is a joint Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Labor training initiative, is so important. Last year, Congress passed, President Obama signed into law the Vow to Hire Heroes Act, which honors our government's obligation to our veterans. VRAP, a component of that law, provides unemployed veterans between 35 and 60 the opportunity to pursue training for new careers in high-demand occupations. As of July 12th, some 33,000 applications have been received nationally for the VRAP program. The program was limited to 99,000 participants through March 31st, 2014. All of us must do everything we can to spread the word to eligible veterans. The number was restricted to 99,000. The expiration date was set March 31st, in large part so we could see how this program worked, we could measure it, we could reintroduce it, we could continue it if it's as effective as I think it will be and as most of us on the Veterans Committee think it will be. Tony Blankenship, another Ohioan from Martins Ferry in Belmont County on the Ohio River in eastern Ohio across from Wheeling, West Virginia, was an Air Force veteran, unemployed iron worker. He plans to study at Belmont College for a career as a medical assistant. There are tens of thousands, there are hundreds of different kinds of jobs, tens of thousands of slots for people to sign up. People can go, in my state, they can go to the Veterans Service Commission. Ohio is one of those lucky states that is not every state does this, that has a Veterans Service Commission funded by taxpayers in local communities. Every county in the state, in the county seat, I believe, in every county has a Veterans Service officer and a Veterans Service Commission whose chief function is to serve returning veterans with health care, with education, with a whole host of any issues that veteran job training, for instance, might deal with. So programs are not only about, programs like the Vow to Hire Heroes Act, programs like VRAP are not only about opportunities for veterans, they're about helping businesses strengthen our economy by meeting the demand for high-skilled workers. We're seeing businesses leverage public and private resources to hire veterans and expand operations. I've met with veterans and veterans advocates from Dayton and Dublin and Mansfield and Chillicothe and Cleveland and Columbus and lots of places around my state to talk to them about how we can partner to help businesses hire unemployed veterans. North Canton, I work with the Chesapeake Energy Corporation to convene a job fair for Ohio veterans seeking employment as equipment operators and truck drivers and electronic and technicians and other high-demand careers, perhaps in the shale development industry. At Cleveland State University's SERVE program, staff discussed their national model of helping service members and veterans transition to civilian life through education and workforce training. At a roundtable I did on Veterans Day, I believe 4 years ago, may have been 5 years ago, in Cleveland at Cleveland State, I talked to veterans I talked to the veterans and to school administrators at Cleveland State about the importance of integrating servicemen and women who have recently left the military, how to integrate them back in the classroom, thinking about a 24-year-old, 25-year-old young man or woman who had been in combat in Iraq sitting next to in class an 18-year-old suburban young man or young woman who had no idea of the kind of life experiences that the veteran, only 6 or 7 years older chronologically, but much older in what he or she had seen in combat. Cleveland State's figured this out, as has Youngstown State, and they've been national models for ways of integrating these servicemen and women back into the classroom to be able to go out only in the workforce. In Columbus, I held a field hearing on veterans unemployment in December. The Solar by Soldiers program is hiring veterans to install energy technology. We need to spread the word about training programs like VRAP that will help provide our veterans with the necessary skills to find good-paying jobs. It's part of our job, again, Madam President, it's part of our job to serve those who have served us so faithfully and so well. Thank you, Madam President. Got it, I figured that. Madam President, I have 11 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, I ask that the I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. It's always good to see the gallery full and the people in town here visiting this process this week here in the Senate. We've actually had a pretty interesting week. We've had a chance to talk about the economy and taxes, something I wish we'd spend more time talking about in the months that I've been here since I got elected last year to the United States Senate. In a few moments later this afternoon, we'll have a vote on a bill that's been called a tax cut bill. The problem with it, and I want people watching here that are maybe not fully familiar with the process, a process I'm still learning, what's going to happen, though, is that Republicans had a bunch of ideas that we wanted to be included. Now, we probably weren't going to win those votes. We're not the majority, but we wanted those ideas to be discussed. And instead, we've been told that that can't happen, that the majority is going to pick our ideas that they're willing to listen to, but the other ideas are going to put aside. The problem with that is that the people of Florida sent me here, and that just like there are 99 other people that serve here, they have a right to have their voice heard. And unfortunately, some of the ideas that we've offered will not get a vote, and therefore we're not going to be able to move forward on that bill as a result. One of the only things the minority party can do in this process here in the Senate to ensure that our voices are heard is ensure that we're not going to allow legislation to move forward unless the rights of the minority are respected, because after all, we represent Americans as well, who have different ideas perhaps than the majority and have a right to have their voices heard. So I hope we can get back to a point where we're working here in the Senate the way it was designed to work, the Senate that I ran to be a part of, not the Senate that we're a part of here today. But I do think what's been good about this week is we've had the chance to talk about the economy. And I know people at home are hearing a lot about the economy and about jobs and about the debt. So I'm trying to make some sense of it for folks that are calling our office, and one of the best ways to do that is to come here on the floor of the Senate and be able to speak about these things, not just to the people that are sitting here today, but to the folks that are going to watch back at home or later on YouTube or wherever this video might be available to them. What I want to talk a little bit about today is the debt and what that means. And what it basically means is that the government of the United States borrows money to pay for our costs because we spend more money than we take in. The federal government, your government, spends more money every year than it takes in taxes and other fees. And so the only place they could get the money to pay for these things is it has to borrow it by selling something called bonds. They sell this debt that we then have to pay back over the years. That's how we fund our government. Almost a third of it now, unfortunately, is funded in that way. And what's happened over the years is because we've spent consistently more than we take in, that's called the deficit. Every single year when you spend more than you take in, that's the annual amount of money that you owe is called the deficit. But it starts building up something called the national debt. And so today we owe just about or over $15 trillion of money that we are going to have to pay back. Let me correct that you're going to have to pay back through your taxes now and in the future. In fact, your great-grandchildren are going to have to pay it back. That's the national debt. And the problem with the national debt is it has become an enormous part of our national economy. It's grown to a very dangerous level as a percentage of our overall economy. Now, what's the way to solve it? The only way to solve it is growth. The only way to solve this problem is to grow our economy. If our economy grows, then the debt becomes smaller as a percentage of our overall economy. Think of it almost as a pie. If the pie gets bigger, the slice gets smaller if you keep it constant. It's the same thing with the debt. If we can keep the debt constant and we can grow the economy, well, then our debt becomes less problematic. So that's really the solution to this problem. And as a point of emphasis, let me tell you, let's suppose that we wanted to get back to what our debt was in 2007. We want our debt to be what it was in 2007. Well, in order to do that, we'd have to come up with over $1 trillion this year to get us back to what our debt was as a percentage back in 2007. It basically means we'd have to either and we'd have to come up with that permanently. The functional reality is that to do that, we'd either have to double everybody's taxes or we would have to cut close to a third of our budget right now. And the point is we can't tax our way or cut our way out of this issue. Now, definitely there has to be cuts, but we can't just cut our way out of this, and we certainly can't tax our way out of it. If you double the tax rates in this country, which is what you would have to do to just get us back to 2007. Number one, you would trigger a massive recession. I mean, the economy would really stop. But number two, it would be impossible to collect it. It's unrealistic. But I'm citing those numbers just to give you an example of why we can't raise taxes. We can't tax our way out of this problem. And we can't simply cut our way out of it either. The only solution is growth, dynamic growth. Not slow growth, big growth. That's the only solution, because if the economy grows, more jobs are created. And if more jobs are created, you have more taxpayers. If someone's unemployed right now, they're not paying income tax. Now they get a job or they get a raise at their job. Even if their rates stay the same, now they're paying more taxes. Now the government has more money to pay down the debt, if it doesn't grow the government. And that's been the problem over the last few years. Our revenue in government has grown. The amount of money coming into the government has actually gone up. But the spending's gone up by even more. And that's why the deficit grows and why the debt grows. So that's how growth would solve this problem. If the economy grows, more people have jobs, and people get raises at their jobs. That means people are making more money, which leads to more growth because they spend that money and they invest that money. But it also means they're generating more revenue for government. And now the government has more money to pay down the debt, and they have to borrow less. That's the solution. So growth is the solution, growing our economy. How do we grow the economy faster? Well, the economy grows because of the private sector. That's how the economy grows. Real growth comes from businesses. It comes from private sector growth, from small businesses and from big businesses, from dry cleaners, from gas stations, from convenience stores, from the guy that cuts your yard, your lawn. That's growth, private sector growth. And here's the truth. If you look at the statistics, it is undeniable. The bigger the government, the smaller the private sector. Because there's only so much money in the world. And the only place government gets its money from is either it has to tax it or borrow it from the private sector. That's really, unless it's going to print more money, which has a whole other set of problems we'll talk about one day, the only way your government can get more money to grow is if it takes it from you, from the private sector. It either has to tax you or it has to borrow the money from you. Either way, it's money that the government has to take out of the private world to grow the government. And here's what happens when you take money out of the private world. That money is no longer available to save. Because if you save it, you're putting it in a bank, and the bank can now use that money to give you a mortgage. Or that's money you no longer have to spend, which means businesses have less customers, and the customers they do have are spending less money. Let me tell you the functional application of that. If you're a waiter or a waitress at a restaurant, and people aren't spending as much because they don't have the money, they're paying it in taxes, that means they're going to restaurants less, which means you're going to make less money in both tips and wages. It may even mean your hours get cut. Millions of Americans know this reality. This is not a theory, this is a reality. If people have less money to spend, they can't spend it at the place where you work. And if they don't have the money to spend at the place where you work, you will make less money, you will work less hours, and you may even lose your job. The other thing the private sector can do with this money is invest it. And that's where you really get growth in the economy. When a business or a businessman or woman has made some money and they take that money and they decide, you know what I'm going to do with this money? I'm going to use it to grow my business. Or I'm going to use this money to start a new business. The problem is if the government takes that money from them, or some of that money from them, they can't do that. And that's why the bigger the government, the smaller the private sector. And the smaller the private sector, the smaller the growth, which is our only solution. That's not a theory, that's a reality. Statistics prove that the bigger the government, the higher the unemployment rate. I didn't bring it today, but I should have a chart that shows. You can see in the chart, every time government size goes up, every time government spending goes up, the unemployment rate goes up. Why? For the reasons that I just told you. That money that government used to grow came out of the private sector. That's money that businesses now don't have to invest or to spend. That's why. Let me tell you another place where it hurts. The higher the government, the worse the stock market does. Why is that? I'll tell you why. Because people buy stock on the hope that they can make a profit on that stock in the future. The problem is that the more the government spends, the higher the taxes are going to have to be in the future to pay for that. And so if people decide, you know what, I think taxes in the future are going to be higher, therefore my chances of making money on stock are going to be less, I'm not going to buy stock. And here's the problem when they don't buy stock. When you buy shares of stock, what you're basically doing is you're investing money in companies. You're investing money in companies so that company can grow and make more money, and then they pay you back a profit. But if people are no longer willing to invest money in companies, these companies can't grow. And if these companies can't grow, that's where you people get unemployed. That's where people's hours get cut. That's where new jobs are not created. That's where kids that are graduating from college can't find a job. The money has to come from somewhere, and the bigger the government, the less of it is available in the private sector to grow. These are facts. Now, one of the arguments we'll hear around here is, well, the Bush tax cuts, which, by the way, is the existing tax code. The Bush tax cuts led to this debt. Well, George Bush cut taxes, and as a result, the government didn't generate enough money, and that's why we have that debt. That's false. Our revenue has grown impressively over the last decade. The problem is that the amount of money we spend has grown even faster. Listen, it doesn't matter if you get a raise. If you get a raise, but your spending grows by even more, you're not going to notice the difference. If you get a $10,000 raise, but you buy something that costs $20,000 more than what you're spending now, you're going to owe more money. That's what we've done here in Washington, certainly before I got here. And by the way, both parties are to blame for that. This is a bipartisan debt, unfortunately. And what's happened is that even though the government has generated more money, it has spent even more. So it's not the Bush tax cuts. That's just not true. The fact of the matter is that we have a spending problem. And let me tell you what's so dangerous about this spending problem. The federal government has grown fast in the past. We've had periods like this before. Let me tell you when they were. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. During those 4 periods, government spending grew really fast. But here's the difference. When the war is over, the war is over. The war happens, you win World War II, and things come back to normal. The difference now is that this is not because of a war. This is because we've grown government. This is permanent. That's the difference between this spike in spending and the other ones in the past. This spike in spending is permanent. That means it's here to stay unless we change it. There is no going back to normal. We have a serious problem. And I've explained to you why the debt hurts you at home. If you're unemployed, if you're underemployed, if you're working twice as hard and making half as much, the debt is part of the problem. Because the government has taken money out of the private sector. Money that used to go to you is now going to the government, now and in the future. So the debt is part of the reason why the economy is not growing and why jobs are not being created. At the end of the day, we can't tax our way out of this, and we can't simply cut our way out of this. Now, let me be clear. There are places to save money. I promise you the federal government wastes money. We should find that and we should eliminate it. It is never a good idea to waste money. But we can't just cut our way. And we certainly cannot tax our way out of this debt problem. We have to grow our way out of this debt problem, grow our economy out of it, not our government out of it. And the only way to grow your economy is for the private sector to grow. But the evidence is clear that the bigger the government, the smaller the private sector. And so therein lies the answer. When we talk about holding constant and lowering the size of government, it's not some ideological talking point. This is not some, conservative versus liberal talking point. This is evidence-based. This is the fact that the statistics are clear, that the bigger the government, the higher the unemployment rate. The bigger the government, the worse the stock market performs. The bigger the government, the less money there is available to create jobs in the private sector. The less money there is available to start new businesses or grow existing businesses. That's why we have to shrink the size of our government. And the sooner we do it, the better we're going to be. And that's what I hope we will work on here in a bipartisan fashion. Both parties helped create this situation. And now I hope both parties will work to solve it. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate terminate the call of the quorum.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate now resume consideration of S. 2237, that the time until 2 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, and that at 2 p.m. today, the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the amendment number 2524. And immediately following that disposition of that amendment, 2524, the Senate proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the substitute amendment 2521. That if cloture is not invoked on the substitute amendment, the Senate then proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on S. 2237. That if cloture is invoked on the substitute amendment, all opposed cloture time be yielded back. Substitute amendment be agreed to, and the Senate proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on S. 2273. If cloture is invoked on the bill, all opposed cloture time be yielded back, and the Senate proceed to vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended. If cloture is not invoked in S. 2273, the bill be returned to the calendar. Further, that there be no other amendments or motions ordered to the amendments or the bill prior to the votes other than motions to waive or motions to table. That there be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes, and all after the first vote be 10 minutes votes. Finally, the Senate then resume the motion to proceed to calendar number 446, S. 3369.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.